Do not for the love of God do any drug because some dumb lady on the internet said they were cool. But if you're gonna disregard my warning anyways, there are some links in the description to educate yourself before doing any drug. Also, anytime I talk about doing drugs, it's fictitious and totally didn't happen. With that out of the way, let's get on to the rest of the video, mates. I don't think that being in possession of some lean green weed, some LSD, or some magic fun guy from the fifth dimension is terrible. Neither is doing them that bad and definitely not worthy of a militarized police force shooting your dog and giving you a jail sentence of up to 8 years. Not to mention that these drugs and substances have plenty of medical applications that far outweigh their potential harm. Like weed being used for pain relief in patients with cancers, MS, or AIDS, and being used as an appetite stimulant for people whose appetites are compromised, like people with cancer, as well as psychedelics being used to treat addiction, PTSD, and anxiety for patients with terminal illnesses. I'm not saying that these are miracle substances that will cure everything wrong with you, but they're a lot less harmful than DARE would have you believe. Drug consumption should be a private matter and addiction should be considered a health and mental health problem, rather than one worthy of police intervention as said earlier. But I'll get more into that when we start the video in a few minutes. Granted, I'm not exactly the most nonpartisan person on the topic of drug decriminalization and integration, especially since I've been known to consume some dank moist grass from time to time on the down low, partner. Oh yeah, if there's any cops watching, you didn't hear that and you should go to a
otolaryngologist
to check your hearing. Anywho, because of my bias, I think that we should take a look at some nonpartisan sources to get a better sense of how Americans feel about weed, shrooms, and LSD.
Hey Apollo, what do you think about drugs? What do you think about drugs, Apollo? Okay, that's very interesting.
We'll be taking a look at a survey about the views of Americans on weed, and if there's anything I know about Americans from my 19 years on this ball of water, is that they love cops, law, order, and all that other cringe shit, so I know they're not going to be in favor. Americans overwhelmingly say that marijuana should be legal for recreational or medical use. According to this survey of 5,109 people living in the United States, collectively 91% believe that weed should be legal. 60% of those people believe that it should be legal for medicinal and recreational use, while 31% of them believe that it should be legal only for medicinal use, with 8% of people not wanting weed legal at all. Interestingly, the survey reports that adults ages 75 and older are less likely to be in favor of legalizing weed for recreational and medicinal use. Human life expectancy in the United States is 78 years old, so I guess pro-legalization people have to play the waiting game. Between Democrats and Republicans, 47% of Republicans are in support of recreational use and pro-medicinal use. 40% are only in favor of legalizing medicinal use. 72% of Democrats are in favor of recreational use and medicinal use, with 23% of Democrats wanting legalization for medicinal use only. So weed legalization isn't as much of a partisan issue between the two major political parties in America. Many other surveys and studies mirror the trends found in this one, that the majority of Americans believe that weed should be legalized for recreational use and medicinal use. The majority of Americans have been thinking that weed should be legal since 2011. So people are pretty in favor of decriminalizing and integrating weed, and those attitudes don't change much towards psychedelics. With 64% of Canadians surveyed believe that the Canadian government should expand legal access to psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for people who qualify under the medical assistance in dying rules, as well as 82% of Canadians surveyed support or somewhat support allowing the use of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. Holy shit, that was a really long sentence. Why did I do this to myself? So most people in North America think that these substances can and should be used in medical settings, and for losers like me who just like doing drugs for fun. So why do they remain illegal despite those facts? Well, to answer that question, we have to take a look at the shifting attitudes towards drug consumption, crime, policing, as well as the racialization of drug consumption. So as you can see, this is going to be another fun, lighthearted video. Look, I'm gonna be making lighthearted stuff, okay? It's in the works. Let's go in. I think we should start by talking about what crime is, how society determines whether something is a crime or not, and why society decides to change the criminality of certain activities. And what better place to look for definitions than the fucking dictionary? Oxford Dictionary defines crime as
an action or omission that constitutes an offense that may be prosecuted by the state and is punishable by law.
It's saying that a crime happens when your action or inaction results in breaking the rules regardless of your intent and is punishable by the state. It doesn't mention morality or tangible harm to society, which I think reveals that most laws are arbitrary and made up by the state and government. Don't get me wrong, laws exist for a reason, but some of them exist simply to enforce white supremacy hierarchy. For example, everyone agrees that murder is bad and it should be illegal because it causes tangible harm to society. But it gets kind of complicated when it comes to crimes such as drug consumption. A good example of a law that serves hierarchy is banning homeless public camping. It doesn't serve to reduce homelessness, but to punish homeless people for being homeless. Many people think that homelessness is caused by personal failings and weak character rather than economic or systemic factors, because our society conditions us to believe that the economic failings of the working class are their fault, which doesn't explain the overrepresentation of black people, disabled people, veterans, LGBTQIA+ folk, and women in homeless populations. The unfortunate truth is that homelessness isn't caused by personal failings, but rather a hierarchy that views certain people as more disposable than others. This will be relevant later, but let's get back to talking about drugs. Say for the sake of argument that I'm in my room just baking up a fucking storm, blazing hotter than hell, really going at it. That thing I'm doing is illegal and would result in me getting in trouble. Even though nobody's getting hurt, I'm just chilling, and the police intervention would really jam up the vibes, bro. Who fucking wrote this? So why does the act of me smoking weed remain illegal? That's because of the way that society views drug consumption, addiction, and dependency. Many of you probably didn't know that many currently illegal drugs weren't always illegal, with many drugs having medicinal and spiritual purposes by many cultures. To quote the book Treating Drug Problems, Volume 2, David T. Courtwright writes,
"In the 19th and early 20th centuries, government involvement was minimal. Drug use was largely a private matter, as was drug treatment. Addiction was understood as either a personal or a medical problem, and various treatments were provided on a fee-for-service basis."
There were effectively no regulations for drugs in the United States, and drugs such as opium and its derivatives were freely and widely used. Pharmacies during this time would also deliberately overprescribe opium products or slip them into their products without telling the end consumer, which most of you know isn't ethical and is something we're dealing with currently as the opium crisis sweeps the nation. Remember kids, capitalism, not even once. While Davy Boy over here is talking about opium and alcohol in his paper, his research applies to the attitudes of many other drugs, especially when discussing the question of what could have possibly changed in the mindset of the United States population to cause people to want to criminalize drugs. It has to do with the changing attitudes towards drugs, and more specifically, alcohol. Most of us in the States learn about temperance, the 18th Amendment, and later 21st Amendment at some point in our school experience, but we never learn about how the attitudes and reforms of that era affect the world nowadays, especially how it affects the way we view drug consumption, addiction, and dependency. So let's do just that. Davey writes in his book,
Victorian Americans were much less worried about drugs, however, than they were about drinks. An influential reform coalition consisting mainly of native-born, white middle-class Protestants attacked alcohol as the principal source of social problems.
These Protestants attacked alcohol as the source of social problems because, as the book states,
drinking was also objectionable because it was associated with groups whose morality was highly suspected, including Catholic immigrants, machine politicians, urban blacks, demi-mondanes, criminals, tramps, casual laborers, etc.
If you thought that comment about urban blacks and their highly suspect morality was terrible, don't worry, it gets worse. It gets much worse. This is where the correlation between drugs and weak character or lack of moral character comes from. But instead of targeting why people would turn to drugs and alcohol in the first place, such as poverty, workers being overworked for dirt poor wages, trying to cope with the pain of working as much as they did, not being able to afford basic needs, or just the institution of capitalism in general. Fuck capitalism. All my homies hate capitalism. They criminalized drugs and alcohol and threw people in jail who needed medical aid more than anything. For those of you out of the loop, in 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, which prohibited the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Keep in mind, this didn't stop people from drinking, making, or selling booze. It just made it more difficult, dangerous, and punishable by law, which led to underground markets for alcohol because of John Adams' grody. I can't not laugh. It's so fucking stupid. Such as speakeasies and the mafia in big cities and moonshiners in the woods. Just like how banning abortion doesn't decrease the number of abortions. The only thing that will prevent abortions is easy access to contraceptives, sex education, and better material conditions for working class women. Cough. Roe v. Wade. As you would guess, this didn't do diddly squat to help alcoholics. As alluded to earlier, all this did was get them in prison where they were left to fend for themselves. Don't worry, we'll talk about addiction later, but for now, we'll leave it at that. In 1933, the ratification of the 21st Amendment lifted the ban on the transportation, production, and sale of alcohol. The amendment repealed the 18th Amendment because people realized it was cringe and not effective at all, like most drug policies. They viewed the enforcement of the 18th Amendment to be a waste of time because it didn't stop people from drinking, making, or transporting alcohol. Since it'll be important for later, hemp, a strain of the cannabis plant, became illegal in 1937. One of the factors that caused it to become illegal has to do with the fact that it competed with some douche named William Hearst's paper and pulp business. Like a true capitalist, he innovated and revolutionized the paper industry so he can get the edge on. Just kidding, he had his competitor's product banned because capitalism isn't about innovation or progress, it's about money. He and many others used anti-hemp propaganda to make it look like it was an evil plant that made you do orgies, parties, and other stuff like that didn't align with American values. As a weed enjoyer, I can say that it doesn't do that. Not to mention that a lot of anti-hemp and anti-marijuana propaganda was racist towards Hispanics, more specifically Mexicans. Something important for later is that in the time before World War II, black folk weren't characterized as addicts or drug users. Addicts, specifically opium addicts, were characterized as white or immigrant Asian workers. But in the time after World War II, white folk viewed black people as violent muggers trying to get their fix because of crime statistics. Statistically, they were more likely to end up in prisons and made up a disproportionate amount of the prison population. But as the book points out, these statistics don't tell the whole story, since black and Hispanic people were and are treated prejudicially by the justice system for... Wait, let me look this up real quick. Oh, they're still being treated like dog shit by the justice system. Back then, black and Hispanic criminals would be tried by all-white juries who would get them in trouble for whatever crime they were accused of, regardless of if they did a crime. This can be thought of as the contributing attitudes to the war on drugs, which we'll get into, but before I do, let's pose a question. How are you supposed to enforce the criminalization of drugs? If you answered with a pseudo-militarized police force that's allowed to shoot your dog with no accountability that works for capital and the state, rather than the community, congratulations, you get a cookie. To start this section, I'm going to have someone read a quote by Nixon aide John L. Kremen. That's probably how you pronounce it.
You know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968, and then Nixon White House after that, had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroines, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Unlike the 18th Amendment, the war on drugs was used specifically to police and silence the anti-war left and black people. The 18th Amendment had tangible goals outside of being a smokescreen for racist bullshit. I want you to keep this quote in mind throughout this section of the video. Drug policy wasn't ever about protecting people from drugs or their assumed harm, but associating certain types of people who are politically inconvenient and pushing them out of the picture. President Nixon officially began the war on drugs by increasing the scale of federal drug control agencies and pushing legislation to push no-knock warrants and mandatory sentencing, which set the foundation for Reagan to expand on the war on drugs. During President Reagan's presidency, the incarceration rate increased a whole buttload, as statisticians would say. The incarceration rate doubled from the beginning of Reagan's presidency to the end of it, due in part to President Reagan and the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, starting an anti-drug campaign with the iconic slogan of, "Just say no." The American public thought that drugs were the #1 issue facing America and leading to the social decline of America. As mentioned earlier, the incarceration rate raised a whole lot. Many Americans looked at the data at face value and concluded that there was something innate about black people that made them more likely to commit crimes and do drugs, without factoring in systemic issues or anything else for that matter, such as the black communities being more proactively policed than white communities. For those of you who don't know, proactive policing is when the police look for crimes instead of waiting for them to happen. This sounds great in theory, but in practice leads to black people being disproportionately policed because of either overt racism or subconscious racism. Just in case you think that this is a conservative thing, here's the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, bragging about how the Dems aren't soft on crime when he was senator.
Very straightforward and simple. He knows there are 2 basic steps here. One step is you must take back the streets. And you take back the streets by more cops, more prisons, more physical protection for the people. So I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended, once and for all, this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime.
The Clintons are also guilty of doing this when talking about urban violence and gangs. I think we should also talk about the intersection between homelessness and drug dependency and addiction. It hopefully won't come as a shock that many homeless people are addicts or have drug dependency. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, 38% of homeless folk have an alcohol dependency and 26% are dependent on other drugs. As you would guess, addiction is often a result of homelessness because of the low quality of life that homeless people face, such as struggling to find food, shelter, warmth, the stress that comes from all of that, and being away from friends and family, which can lead to mental health problems and health problems. This brings us full circle when you remember that many homeless populations are minorities. If you thought that was oddly well written for one of my videos, that's how I feel too. Anyways, let's wrap this up with... As I've detailed throughout this long video, drug policy here in the United States isn't about recidivism or treating addiction, and is instead about control, subjugation, and enforcing the status quo and the white supremacy hierarchy of society. Anybody who thinks that United States drug policy isn't a smokescreen for racism hasn't had that bubble popped yet. So what would treat addiction and contribute to recidivism? I don't know, but I do know that United States drug policy isn't the way to go, but I do have some ideas. Actual drug education and not whatever the hell DARE was trying to be. Educating people about these substances, what their effects are, and how to help people with addiction would be far more helpful than DARE could ever hope to be. Treating addiction as a medical issue and not one of criminality. Shifting the attitudes towards drugs as something that people do, rather than showing lack of moral character or weak moral character, as well as integrating drugs into the medical field and regulating drugs so nobody puts horse tranquilizer in my weed. On a side note, this is a real thing that is happening, and I know of people that have almost lost their lives. This can be stopped by regulating drugs and making sure you're getting the thing that you want and not being contaminated with something that can kill you. Test your drugs, even if it's somebody you trust. Sorry for turning this video into a public service announcement for a bit, but as well as creating better material conditions for the working class so they don't feel the need to resort to drugs and alcohol, as well as defunding the police and putting money into community defense programs to help with non-violent crimes, like addiction, mental health crises, and other things that aren't helped by somebody pointing a gun at you. If the police want the prestige of being public defenders, they should actually risk their lives in service to the community, rather than the shoot first, ask questions later attitudes of many police officers. The police should be held accountable and should answer to the community and the people. But the topic of the police and how to reform them is a different subject for another video. That's it. That's the end of the video. Thanks for watching the video. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff that the people tell you to do on YouTube videos. This video took a long time to research, edit, script, voiceover, etc. So please do that. It'd be really appreciated, primarily. Recording this, like, after editing everything. The video is basically done as I recorded this, but it's not out. It's fucking awful. Not the video, just the process. It was very hard, and I would appreciate it if you liked and commented and subscribed. All that. Future video. The next video might be on Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, so that's nice. Finally, I told you that lighthearted stuff that commented in the introduction, that was real. We're gonna have like a happy Lily video for once. Anyways, thanks for watching. Peace out.